Sure, you know the headliners, the Towering Inferno, the Poseidon Adventure, Earthquake, but there's another shelf, the one we binge for comfort on sick days and laugh at 2 a.m. with friends. The Guilty Pleasures. These films are big on spectacle, bigger on melodrama, with logic gaps you could drive an airport fire truck through. And yet, we love them. They bottle the era's social anxieties in gloriously camp packaging. Tonight, we're dusting off that forgotten shelf. The comfort watches, the cult curios, the crackers that still hit. 7 forgotten 1970s disaster movies that changed Hollywood. 1. The Cassandra Crossing, 1976.
Why? 1,000 human beings on a journey to nowhere with one-way tickets to hell.
This one is a plague movie disguised as a disaster movie. Starts with terrorists breaking into a lab, accidentally unleashing a deadly virus. One gets infected. Yeah, basically treat the passengers like expendable lab rats. The cast is ridiculous. Sophia Loren, Richard Harris, Martin Sheen, Ava Gardner, Burt Lancaster, even O.J. Simpson shows up as a cop. It screams international production because the producers clearly wanted every major market covered. Europe, America, everywhere. When you watch it now, it feels way ahead of its time. The whole idea of government cover-ups, quarantine decisions made behind closed doors, passengers turning on each other, doctors fighting for scraps of truth. It's the same DNA you see in Contagion, Outbreak, 12 Monkeys. All decades later. Cassandra Crossing gave that shape first, even if critics tore it apart back then. Censors didn't love it either. Some countries cut scenes of the plague spreading because Cold War audiences were already paranoid about biological warfare. In Italy, it got slapped with restrictions. Eastern Europe trimmed whole chunks of dialogue around government negligence. Didn't matter. The movie still got global release because the star power was too big to completely bury. It wasn't a hit on the level of Poseidon or Inferno, but it carved out a new niche. Hollywood figured out that viral disaster was its own subgenre. And when studios later needed to cash in on epidemic paranoia, they had Cassandra Crossing sitting there as proof the formula worked. 2. Skyjacked, 1972.
Roll the dice!
Airport in 1970 proved something simple. Planes in danger made money. MGM saw that and thought, what if we don't just copy Airport, what if we twist it? Instead of bad weather or an engine failure, they went darker. Skyjacked put Charlton Heston in the pilot's seat and dropped a ticking time bomb in the form of a Vietnam vet who loses it mid-flight, waves a gun, and demands the plane head for Moscow. Suddenly, a normal flight turns into a flying pressure cooker. The movie worked because hijackings were already everywhere in the news. It wasn't fantasy. People were boarding planes in the early 70s knowing there was a real chance some guy would stand up mid-flight and say they were all going to Cuba. Skyjacked tapped straight into that paranoia. The villain here wasn't just a random thug either. He was a soldier broken by the war, convinced the U.S. government had betrayed him. That detail gave the story a weight that other popcorn thrillers didn't dare touch in 1972. James Brolin plays the hijacker, and he doesn't play him as cartoon crazy. He's paranoid, twitchy, unraveling, but you see the damage underneath. It's not subtle, but it was a direct nod to what America was dealing with. Thousands of veterans coming home with scars nobody wanted to talk about. Hollywood wrapped it up as a thriller, but it was still there. The rest of the film sticks tight to a formula that became standard later. You've got the captain who has to stay calm and keep the passengers alive. You've got the crew trying to balance fear and control. You've got the passengers splitting into groups, some hysterical, some brave, some ready to crack. That mix is what every hijack thriller since has borrowed. You can trace the entire template forward. Passenger 57, Executive Decision, Air Force One. Even modern TV episodes about hijacks still lean on what Skyjacked set up. Heston later said he didn't think much of the script. He wasn't wrong. The dialogue isn't sharp, but his presence gave the film authority. He looks like a guy who could land a plane in a storm and still have time to glare down the bad guy. Audiences bought into him, and that was enough. The movie wasn't a blockbuster, but it made its money back and told studios there was space for man-made disasters. It wasn't just earthquakes or skyscraper fires. A single unstable human being could fuel a disaster picture. Critics were split. Some thought it was shameless exploitation of real hijacked tragedies. Others dismissed it as formula TV blown up to movie size. But it still stuck. 3. Avalanche, 1978. By the late 70s, Irwin Allen was the king of disaster. Poseidon Adventure, The Towering Inferno, both giant hits. So when he backed Avalanche, expectations were sky high. The setup seemed strong enough. Rock Hudson running a luxury ski resort, Mia Farrow as his estranged wife, Robert Forster as a photographer warning about looming danger. Then it happens. A wall of snow comes crashing down the mountain, burying the resort and everyone in it. It had all the right pieces, a big cast, a personal drama running under the disaster, and a spectacle payoff. Allen even spent money on effects, miniatures, controlled snow slides, staged avalanches, but the result looked cheap. The avalanche scenes lacked the terror of Inferno's fireballs or Poseidon's flooding rooms. Extras lay under piles of snow that looked like cotton batting. The destruction never felt massive enough to match the hype. The pacing didn't help. The first hour is mostly melodrama between Hudson and Farrow. Their arguments drag, the dialogue clunks, and by the time the avalanche hits, audiences were already restless. Critics tore it apart, calling it Allen's first real disaster as a producer. Word spread fast, and the box office tanked. But buried inside the flop is something interesting. Avalanche is one of the first big-budget attempts at a nature strikes back disaster story. Before this, most films in the cycle focused on human error or accidents, fires, building collapses, mechanical failures. Avalanche put the enemy in nature itself. The mountain doesn't care who you are. It just swallows the resort whole. That angle later grew into an entire branch of the genre. Volcano, Dante's Peak, The Day After Tomorrow, 2012. Allen didn't nail it, but he planted the seed. Forster's character also stands out. He plays the voice of environmental warning, the guy who sees development pushing too far into fragile areas. That's a theme Hollywood didn't really chase until the eco-disaster boom decades later. It's clunky in Avalanche, but it's there. Audiences in 1978 mocked it, and Allen took a hit. Studios cooled on throwing big money at natural disaster scripts after seeing Avalanche flop. But in hindsight, it's more influential than it looks. It showed that snow, ice, and nature itself could be cinematic threats. The execution may have been campy, but the idea carried forward. Today, Avalanche sits in that cult space. People watch it to laugh at the fake snow, the stiff acting, the soap opera subplots. But if you strip away the flaws, you can see Hollywood testing a new direction for disaster cinema. 4. Juggernaut, 1974.
Oh, you're a good man, Juggernaut. But so am I. How do we defuse the bombs?
There's half a dozen triggers hidden away in here, all to be cut through before we reach the timer.
Forget collapsing buildings or fireballs. Juggernaut goes smaller, but sharper. A luxury ocean liner cruising the Atlantic gets hijacked, not by men with guns, but by a guy who plants 7 bombs on board. He calls himself Juggernaut, phones in his demands, and dares the authorities to defuse them before time runs out. Richard Harris plays the bomb disposal expert flown in by helicopter. Omar Sharif captains the ship. The tension isn't from spectacle. It's from watching Harris crawl through the bowels of the ship, trying to defuse live bombs while the clock ticks down. Every wrong move could blow hundreds of passengers sky high. The movie doesn't lean on effects. It leans on sweat. Close-ups, nervous hands, wires being cut. It's practically a prototype for Speed or even Die Hard with a Vengeance. A technical problem thriller where every second matters more than explosions. Production was no joke either. The filmmakers shot on a real ship at sea, dealing with waves, cramped spaces, and actual danger. Harris did a lot of his own crawling through tiny compartments, which gave the film a gritty authenticity missing from glossier disaster epics. Critics were split. Some said it lacked spectacle, others praised the suspense. At the box office, it did okay. Not a smash, but not a bomb either. Its real legacy showed up years later when Hollywood rediscovered the bomb-on-board template. Juggernaut proved you didn't need collapsing towers to generate tension. You just needed a guy with a bomb, a confined space, and a timer. That stripped-down disaster formula ended up influencing a whole wave of thrillers in the 80s and 90s. 5. The Swarm, 1978. By the late 70s, Irwin Allen was basically running on fumes. He'd made his name the master of disaster with Inferno and Poseidon, but The Swarm was where the cracks showed. The pitch alone sounds insane. Billions of killer bees invade Texas, and the military scrambles to stop them. The movie takes itself completely seriously, which is part of the reason it became a legend for the wrong reasons. Caine storms through the film shouting about bees like he's in Shakespeare. Scientists ramble on about venom and toxins, and the military brass argue in war rooms while entire towns get wiped out. Allen doesn't hold back on the spectacle. He stages train crashes, burning fields, collapsing buildings, even exploding helicopters, all blamed on swarms of bees. Here's the thing. Nobody bought it. Critics hammered it for wooden dialogue and goofy effects. Audiences stayed away. By the time the credits rolled, The Swarm was branded one of the worst films of the decade. But look closer, and you see why it mattered. It was one of the first big attempts at turning an ecological threat into a full-scale disaster picture. The Swarm also marked the beginning of the end for Irwin Allen's reign. The budget ballooned, the box office tanked, and his grip on the genre slipped. By the early 80s, studios stopped handing him blank checks for all-star spectacles. Still, his misfire created a blueprint for creature-based disaster thrillers. People laugh at The Swarm now, but every Nature Strikes Back movie owes it something. 6. Meteor, 1979.
That meteor is 5 miles wide and it's definitely gonna hit us!
By the late 70s, Cold War paranoia was baked into almost every Hollywood thriller. Meteor took that fear, threw in a giant space rock, and tried to sell it as the next evolution of the disaster craze. Sean Connery plays a NASA scientist who discovers a massive asteroid heading straight for Earth. Natalie Wood tags along as a Soviet scientist, and suddenly the U.S. and USSR are forced into an uneasy alliance to stop extinction. The plan? Fire a wave of nuclear missiles and hope for the best. It's perfect disaster movie fuel. Cosmic destruction, cutting-edge special effects, political tension. It should have been a slam dunk. The cast alone screamed prestige. Connery brings his usual steel. Wood adds some humanity. Karl Malden shows up. And Martin Landau gets to chew scenery as a stubborn military type. The problem was execution. The effects were hyped as groundbreaking, but audiences found them clunky. Models of asteroids crashing into cities looked more like TV miniatures than Hollywood spectacle. The pacing dragged too. Half the movie is boardroom arguments about politics, with only brief moments of chaos when fragments hit Earth. The movie did make some bold choices, though. It framed the Cold War rivalry as the real obstacle, not the asteroid itself. Watching American and Soviet leaders slowly realize cooperation is the only path forward was a sharp political angle for a genre usually built on screaming extras and collapsing scenery. That same angle got recycled in later sci-fi disaster films, where nations reluctantly unite under pressure. 7. Beyond the Poseidon Adventure, 1979.
At midnight on New Year's Eve, the SS Poseidon, caught in a violent Mediterranean storm, is struck by a 90-foot tidal wave and capsized.
Sequels were still a gamble in the 70s. Studios weren't cranking out cinematic universes yet, but they knew when a hit left money on the table. The Poseidon Adventure had made a fortune in 1972, so Warner Brothers decided to drag audiences back onto the capsized ship 7 years later. Beyond the Poseidon Adventure was the result, and it's every bit as chaotic as the title suggests. This time, Michael Caine leads a salvage crew that boards the overturned liner, hoping to strip valuables. Along the way, they run into another group with very different motives: Sally Field, Telly Savalas, and a bunch of desperate survivors. The sequel did everything bigger except the one thing people actually wanted: suspense. The original worked because it trapped ordinary people in an extraordinary situation, forcing them to climb, crawl, and scrape their way to survival. Critics tore it apart, and the box office numbers confirmed it. This was no repeat of 72. Still, the movie is fascinating for what it tried. It was one of the earliest examples of Hollywood experimenting with genre-mixing sequels. Instead of just repeating the formula, the filmmakers bolted on new elements in the hope of keeping things fresh. Pirates, plutonium, and treasure hunting in a sunken ship. And yet, it did leave fingerprints. Later, salvage gone wrong thrillers like Virus, Ghost Ship, or even James Cameron's Titanic documentaries borrowed from the idea of mixing disaster settings with outside motives like greed or crime. Beyond didn't succeed, but it showed Hollywood that audiences might go for disaster plus something else, if the balance was right. 7 forgotten 70s disaster flicks, 7 messy lessons. Which one surprised you most? And what did we miss? Until next time, keep the 70s rolling and stay nostalgic.